Thanks so much, Eoghan, for such a warm welcome, and Glóna Móna as well, as always. And also thank you all for coming to this conversation as well. Absolutely delighted to introduce Eoghan Daltun. Eoghan is an author, a conservator of sculpture and an environmental campaigner. He's based near Airries in the Beara Peninsula in County Cork, and Eoghan is a pioneer in the rewilding movement that seeks to restore native forests that once blanketed 80% of Ireland and now just cover 1%, which is one of the lowest rates in Europe. So in 2022, Eoghan published his book, An Irish Atlantic Rainforest, which was a personal journey into the magic of rewilding. And so we plug. And so then this September, he's launched his newest book, The Magic of an Irish Rainforest, which is a visual journey, which is going to be part of this discussion. And so the format of this evening, basically, Eoghan's going to chat about his book and about his work, and then we'll open the floor up and have like a bit of a conversation of back and forth, because I know there's lots of people in Belfast in this area doing amazing environmental campaigning works, and I'm sure there's lots that we can learn from each other. So, Gormila Eoghan.
Thanks very much, Leasha. I have to say, I've only been in Belfast for about 24 hours, and I'm just blown away by the energy of the place, by by all of the stuff that's going on that I've encountered just in the course of today. I feel privileged to be here and to be invited up. So thank you all for getting me to come up and give a bit of a talk. So what I'm going to talk about is the journey that I've been on for the last 15 years or so, which is, so to begin, to go back to before that, I'm from Dublin, essentially. And I spent years rebuilding an 18th century cottage in the Kilmainham area in Dublin, and then headed off to Italy for 7 years. I ended up being there for 7 years, studying sculpture. But before I went to Italy, I'd already decided that the house that I'd rebuilt in Kilmainham, that I was going to sell it at some stage and buy some land down the country, somewhere in Ireland. I didn't know yet know where. But what I had in mind was to buy a piece of land and plant lots of native trees and spend the rest of my life watching them grow into a forest. So while I was in Italy, I was coming home every summer for several months, on holiday and working, but also kind of like in the back of my mind, I was kind of looking around at where I might like to end up, in what part of Ireland I might like to ultimately live in. And on one of those trips, I went to a peninsula in the southwest called the Beara Peninsula. So, I guess like I remember from years ago, there used to be these kind of political graphics that showed Britain as this kind of like policeman with a big truncheon hitting Ireland over the head from behind. And Ireland looked like a kind of a teddy bear kind of a figure. So if you think about the feet of the teddy bear, you've essentially got these 5 peninsulas that stick straight out into the Atlantic. And Beara is the middle of those. And it's the wildest of them. It's the least touristed, and it's the one, when I went there, I fell absolutely in love with the place. And I think what attracted me to the Beara, well, there were several things. My brain was in a kind of a sculptural mode because I was studying sculpture over in Italy. I was making sculpture. That was where my head was at. And the forms of the mountains and the rock forms just seemed to me eminently sculptural, and that attracted me straight away. There were several other things that I liked about it as well. But on top of all that, what I saw was that some of the properties that I saw for sale in the Beara, if they had been left unfarmed for any kind of a period of time, they'd gone back to wild nature by themselves. So you're not talking about anybody going and planting anything, saying, let's make this into a kind of a nature reserve. It was literally just the withdrawal of human extractive activities that allowed wild nature to come flooding back. So I said, I started to think, do you know what? It may be that I might, if I'm really lucky, I might be able to find a place where I don't need to plant any trees at all, that the wild native trees will already be there. And so that became the thought that I went forward with. But as I say, I was coming back and forth between Italy, and then I finished up in Italy and moved with my family back to Dublin, back to the house in Kilmainham. And was focusing the search on Beara. And this place came up for sale, and I won't go through, there's a big long story attached to how it came together, but in the end it came together. And from the moment that I saw this piece of land, I was just awestruck. So it was a 73-acre farm on the north side of the Beara Peninsula, and it looks out over the open Atlantic, including the Skelligs to the west, and the Beara Peninsula to the north. That's the next of the 5 fingers up. And to the east, or the northeast, you've got the McGillicuddy Reeks, including Carán Túil, Ireland's highest mountain. So I just loved all that. And a whole bunch of other islands as well as the Skelligs. You've got Déanish and Scariff and Inishfernard and other islands. The land itself was incredibly complex. So really, really rough, with high rock escarpments, 30-foot high, deep kind of canyon-like gorges with rushing torrents coming down off the mountain, boulders, scree, what are called knife-edge slabs. So the geology is sandstone, which cleaves off into these kind of like what are called knife-edge slabs that stick up at all angles. So incredibly rich and diverse topographically. But the best thing of all was what was overlying this terrain, which was this wild forest. And the first time I walked the land, I had immense difficulty containing my emotions, because what I was seeing was just so mind-blowing. I was walking around it with a fixed lump in my throat, and my heart was beating in my chest. It felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. So what you had were all of these trees growing at all angles of oak, birch, willow, hazel, holly, rowan, and a whole bunch of others. But the important thing to say about these trees, again, is that nobody had planted them. They'd grown because the livestock had been taken off the land. And I'll just jump ahead here for a second and say, you cannot compare a planted forest, even if the species are native, to a forest that's planted by nature. They're 2 entirely different things. And that's not to say that trees should never be planted. Oftentimes you have to, but nature plants in a way that we absolutely just cannot, in ways and in places that people cannot replicate. And that's what I found, was a wild-grown native forest. And I was just mesmerized by all of this. I managed to. So about a year later, there were various complications to do with the title on the place, which delayed everything. But about a year later, I sold my house in Dublin, and we bought this farm, and we moved down. But even before that happened, I knew that there were serious ecological problems with this place. Despite this incredible beauty, I knew that ecologically it was in a really, really desperate state. And the reasons for that were simple enough. To begin with, severe overgrazing by two non-native invasive species. So first of all, somebody had released several goats into the area, and they had bred and bred and bred and bred until you had over 100 living in the immediate area, and their central hangout was the forest on the farm that I bought. On top of the goats, you also have Sika deer in the area, which were introduced in the 1860s by Lord Lansdowne, who had the estates around Kenmare. And the effect that these two species, primarily the goats, but also the Sika, the effect that they were having was, first of all, they were preventing the forest from regenerating at all. So every little oak or birch or holly or sally or whatever else that germinated as a seedling would immediately get eaten, and therefore the trees couldn't reproduce, and any population that can't reproduce will of course just start to die off. What they were also doing was stripping the bark off a lot of the existing trees, which if the bark is stripped off all the way around the trunk, the tree just dies. So the whole forest was littered with dead and dying trees. They had stripped out entirely the incredibly rich ground floor that you should have in an ecosystem like this. So from about this height down, there was nothing there apart from mosses and a couple of inedible plants like bracken fern. It was literally as if you had an army of people going around with strimmers, constantly strimming away all vegetation. All you had from about that height down were the actual trunks of the trees and then rocks covered in moss and some of this bracken fern and stuff. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, by this severe overgrazing was also causing creating the perfect conditions for invasive non-native plant species to take over. So you had about 8 or 9 of these, but the worst of the whole lot was one called Rhododendron ponticum. And most of the forest had rhododendron or some of these other 7 or 8 non-native invasive species taking over. So it was literally, the forest had arrived at a point where if it had been allowed to continue, it would have started to really kind of like spiral out of control into this kind of like ecological meltdown. So what I did after buying the place is I applied for a grant under a scheme called the Native Woodland Scheme to put up a fence around most of the mature forest to fence out the goats and the Sika. And both species can jump a regular kind of a sheep or cattle fence this high. So it has to be a high fence of about 2 meters high to keep them out. And in the meantime, I set to work getting rid of the rhododendron and the other alien plant species, which was pretty tough work, and I was doing it in my spare time. After about 1.5 years, my grant application was approved, and contractors came in and put up a fence around 21.5 acres where most of the forest was. A really, really tough job for them, and a very expensive job as well. So it cost to fence off just 21.5 acres, and this was in 2010. It cost 37 grand in euros. So pretty. I didn't pay for that. The state paid for that. Over the following years, and ever since, so you're talking 14 years now at this stage, I've been witness to the most spectacular ecological transformation in the land inside. So what you started to see was first of all, tree seedlings started to pop up everywhere, all of the nature. So there were about a dozen different native tree species in the place. So you started to get little oaks and birches and hazels and everything popping up everywhere, including like in the open areas that weren't forested around the existing forest. Within the existing forest, you started to get wildflowers popping up. Initially just little bits here and there, but kind of like accelerating as time went on. So in the beginning it was just like a few bluebells here, a few wood anemone there, a couple of dog violets, yellow pimpernel. But that has never stopped. It's like something that's been snowballing ever since. Some of the open areas started to transition very, very rapidly into forest. So, you know, those little seedlings that popped up, instead of getting grazed off straight away, they were able to carry on growing into saplings. And in some areas, within 6 or 7 years, you had gone from just barren, sterile grasses. There's a particular type of grass where I am that people call Finan. So Irish is still used. It's still nobody speaks Irish in Beara, but they still use a lot of Irish words in their everyday speech. And even the things they say in English very often come from Irish. Like people will say, there's no hunger on me, instead of I'm not hungry, you know, directly from Níl Ucrasorum. So they call this stuff Finan, and it's a very tough grass. It's called purple moor grass in English. And it's one of the few things that can withstand constant grazing by livestock or deer or whatever. So areas where that's all you had transformed into young closed canopy forest within only 6 or 7 years in some areas. So really, really rapid. And the whole place just absolutely came to life in terms of the floral diversity and abundance of what was there in the kind of the ground layer of the forest. Actually, if I may, I'll just read you a quick passage from the book that maybe describes that process better than I am now. So, in the years after the deer fence went up, I was privileged to be witness to the most stunning, magical transformation of the land inside. Native tree seedlings began to pop up everywhere and, rather than being immediately eaten to death, were able to carry on growing into adolescence and beyond, giving rise to what has since become new young forest in areas that had previously been just grass. Where trees were already present, a rich dormant ground flora began to reawaken, with a great profusion of woodland flowers appearing, many of them species that I had presumed were completely absent. Tapestries of bluebell, lesser celandine, wood anemone, my favourite, bugle, primrose, dog violet, pignut, sanicle, wild angelica, herb robert, wood sorrel, opposite-leaved golden saxifrage, marsh violet, yellow pimpernel, barren strawberry, wood avens, enchanter's nightshade, germander speedwell. All these and a plethora of others would burst into fluorescence in a rolling display lasting from early spring into late summer. The visual effect was one of wildly splashing impressionist colour about the blank canvas of a previously barren woodland floor. Slowly at first, but at an ever-increasing velocity thereafter, life in all its vibrancy was coming back to the woods. The many wetter open areas similarly exploded with their own palette of yellow flag, ragged robin, cuckoo flower, heath-spotted orchid, devil's bit scabious, sheep's bit, and purple loosestrife, to name just some of the many wildflowers that emerged. All this helped create the conditions for a great boon in insects, which in turn attracted additional numbers of birds. More and more, the whole place buzzed with flying creatures and rang with birdsong. The change was radical on practically every level. Seeing that coming to life unfold, it has never slowed, has often reminded me of the early scenes in a much-loved picture book I had as a child, and which was passed on to my own boys when they were small. Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak tells of a young boy named Max who's sent to his bedroom without supper for making mischief. As he stands there in his wolf costume, the room around him begins to morph, scene by scene, into a wild forest. The walls and bedposts become trees, and the ceiling turns into a night sky full of stars and a bright moon. Max finds himself in a marvellous wonderland in which he goes on to have the most fantastic adventures before finally getting back to his bedroom to find his supper waiting for him. For me, those first images of Max's bedroom conjure perfectly the metamorphoses I have observed in the Bothical woods as they have gone from a partially empty sterility and dying state to the chaotic and tangled fullness of a healthy forest. So, that gives you some idea of what I've been seeing happen just outside my door, because I had to build a house on the land. The house that was there was just a ruin. So the forest is literally outside my door. And all of that extra life has attracted in several rare species of native mammals. So you had lesser horseshoe bats turn up first. There are really rare, internationally rare species of bat that are in decline across all their former range across Europe. And there's only about 14,000 of them even in Ireland, which is one of their main last strongholds. So, they're about, as a colony of about 60 now, so that's a really big deal. Pine martens showed up only a few years ago. Ireland's rarest native mammal, and also otters have started to come up the stream. So it's been, and I'm sure there's lots of other stuff that I'm less aware of, that's the changes that have happened. And it's been just the most wonderful, joyous thing to happen in my life, to experience. And I honestly, as best I can with words in my book and speaking to you now, I try to convey just how mind-blowing it's been to see all of this happen, but there's no way I can. I do my best, but words just don't do justice. But the other side of all this is a much more difficult side, a much far more painful side to the whole thing, which is that when you see firsthand what wild nature can look like in Ireland, how vibrant and dynamic and rich it can be, and you travel across Ireland, north and south, all you see, almost everywhere you look, is just this wasteland. And most of us don't even know it, because we grew up thinking that was what was normal. So if you go up to most of where I'm from in Dublin, the Wicklow Mountains, the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains, when I was a kid, I would have thought that was wild and natural, because you contrasted it with the city, and you said, sure, and you looked at the geological formations, and it felt wild because you're out in big open spaces with kind of like lakes and mountains. So you think that's the wild. But what you're actually looking at, and it's the same here on the mountains nearby. I was up on Cave Hill. I spent time there the last time I was in Belfast, and it's a wonderful area, and there's a lot of really cool stuff there. But the mountains beyond, it's the same as pretty much uplands across the whole of Ireland. The Mournes, the Sperrins, the McGillicuddy Reeks. Everywhere you go, you see the same thing. and they're wastelands. They're sheep-grazed deserts. All of these places would have been rich ecosystems in the past. So it's estimated that Ireland in prehistory was about 80%, as Leasha said, about 80% forested, which would have been not just, that forest would have been hugely diverse. Like within my place, it's unbelievable. Like you can walk from here to the back of the room and the whole character of the place that you're in completely changes. No one bit is the same as any other one bit. And it's the same, you walk through the whole place and that change keeps happening, you know. And it would have been the same with the forests that we had in Ireland. They would have been incredibly diverse in terms of the species composition, all sorts of other stuff. And the other 20% that wasn't forest would have been other types of equally rich natural ecosystems like bog and other types of wetlands and maybe wildflower grasslands and wild rivers. And we've gone from that down to only around 1% in terms of forest now. That's where we're at now. Well, that's 1% within the Republic. I don't know what it would be if you add what it is north of the border. But in a way, even worse than the fact that we're down to only 1% is the fact that virtually all of those little fragments that we have left are in the same state as my place was when I arrived. So wrecked by overgrazing and invasive plant species. So, for example, near me, or not too far from me, is the most important remaining piece that we have on the whole island of Ireland, which is Killarney National Park. And it's in bits, in the exact same way as my place was: goats, cica and rhododendron. It's in totally in bits. And the ecologists have been calling the problems out for over half a century now. And Killarney National Park is in the supposed care of the Irish state, and nothing has been done in over half a century to change that kind of downward trajectory. And it's so, I get so bloody angry, like, you know, because if one guy, me, can transform a patch of Irish and that's the other thing I didn't say, was that it's actually rainforest. I'll talk about that in a moment. But, you know, what is stopping the state with all its resources from sorting these places out? And you can go across, so in the Republic we have 8 national parks, and it's the same thing in all of them. There are no exceptions. They're all in bits. And it's the same across all of the various little pockets that are either in private ownership or that are not national parks. Virtually all of them are dying. They're going down the tubes, and across the border onto this side, and it's no different. I was up in Breen Woods last summer in County Antrim, and you know, same thing again. So, you know, it's really infuriating, and it's kind of depressing as well. But there is a really hope. There are 2 things that are really hopeful to me in all of this. The first thing is the sheer power of nature to come back if we stop doing the things that we as a species do to nature that repress it, either by allowing our livestock to graze off all the seedlings and other important flora, or else, I mean, I guess, like, you know, it's important to understand that across the whole island of Ireland, north and south, you've got artificially elevated levels of grazing. So grazing is a natural process. Grazing is a natural part of ecosystems, but it's regulated in a natural ecosystem by predation. We have, our species has killed off the wolves, the lynx, the bear, that would have regulated grazing animals, both in terms of their numbers and their behaviour. And that has allowed their numbers to explode of wild grazers. And then we have all the livestock, the sheep, the cows, the goats as well. So pretty much the whole island of Ireland is grazed at artificial levels. So, you know, the first really hopeful thing in all this is that power of nature. If we take away these artificial pressures to kind of respond in the most fantastically positive way. The other thing that gives me hope is the way people across the island. So after this book came out, I've been asked to give talks the length and breadth of Ireland, all through last year and a bit the year before and this year as well. And people, there's a real hunger in people to reconnect with our natural heritage and wild nature on this island. The problem that people have is that they have nowhere really to go where they can even see what wild nature looks like, because we've only got tiny little slivers left, you know, most of which are wrecked, you know. So that is an obstacle. But I think what's filling that vacuum is people's imagination. And I think that's only going to continue to build and build and build. I'll just very quickly finish by saying, you know, as part of the whole process of restoring this ecosystem on the Beara Peninsula, I absolutely kind of deep dived into ecology. I was just voraciously reading everything I could on ecology, which is the science of ecosystems. Ecology is the mechanics of how ecosystems and essentially the planet that we live on. Ecology is the kind of the mechanics of how all that works. And particularly woodland ecology I was especially interested in. And after only a couple of years, the most amazing, you know, thing started to dawn on me, that at first I couldn't believe it. I thought, no, this can't, I must be dreaming here. I must be imagining this. But the more I looked at it and thought about it, it was just undeniable that what I had in this place in Beara wasn't just native forest, it was actually rainforest. And the mad thing was that at the time, nobody in Ireland was talking about rainforests in an Irish context. And so here was me, this guy, I'm not trained in any of the natural sciences, I don't have a PhD in botany or ecology or biology or anything. And I'm saying this is rainforest, but none of these experts are even saying this. You know, I better just shut up about this or they'll think I'm a total lunatic. But over time, I said no, you know, I got a bit braver, I suppose, and I ended up writing the book about it. And that has been just absolutely amazing. And I think that's one thing that really grabs people as well, is the realization that, you know, I mentioned that figure of 80% of Ireland would once, before farming, so up until around the Neolithic, which was when farming came in, Ireland, about 80% of Ireland would have been forested. Most of that, not all, but most of that would probably have been rainforest, because we have the conditions. It's wet enough and mild enough to give rise to what we would have, to rainforest. And the rainforest that we have here, so when you think about rainforests, you think about tropical rainforests. What we have here are what are known as temperate rainforests. And they're no less rich or beautiful or important than the tropical rainforests that they have in the Amazon or the Congo or Southeast Asia, you know. So it's one of the things that I'm trying to advocate for, is not just that these places be protected as they should, but also the conditions be created for them to expand back out, so that 1% starts to grow and build. And just to go back to something that I touched on in the beginning, I know everybody loves planting trees, but the best way to do this is to create the conditions, i.e. to prevent the overgrazing and allow the wild trees to expand back out, because that way it's not just the wild trees that are expanding back out, but all of the associated biodiversity, all of the wildflowers, the lichens, the mosses, the ferns, the mycorrhizal fungi, the invertebrates, the whole shebang all spreads back out, and you get the expansion of the entire ecosystem of thousands of species that are all intricately connected. So that's my rant over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eoghan. That was, really powerful. Quite a few times there I was getting chills listening to you talk about just like all the different flowers that have came back into the area that you've rewilded.
Thank you.
So really incredible. And I think what also kind of struck me as you were speaking is obviously we're coming from two different contexts when we're talking about rewilding, because you're rewilding an area of that's extremely rural, and we're talking about rewilding in the context of a city ecosystem, and they're quite different. And just as you were listing some of the species, I was thinking about all the time I saw the otter coming out of the River Lagan, and like the bats that I feel flying like low overhead when I'm out for my walks and stuff. And so it was nice to remember that like those are there, but they're also here. And just also when you were saying about the plants that came back, I was thinking about how incredible it is that this like rich diversity of plant species is just like lying in wait in the soil, like it's just biding its time, waiting for the right time to come back. And there's just something really, really powerful in that. So the first thing I wanted to really ask you was, we've gone from, like we were saying, 80% of the land being covered in forest in a relatively short space of time in terms of like how long human history is, would you say? And to think that we've gone from 80% to 1% can be like quite disheartening. And so we can't obviously go back, we can only ever go forward. So kind of where would you sort of suggest that we start in terms of our context in like city ecosystems with that kind of thing?
Yeah, thank you, Leasha. Lots of stuff in there. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that I don't know, well, certainly in the Republic, we were all raised with this idea that it was the English who came down and cut down, who came over and cut down all Ireland's forests. And there is a bit of truth in that, but it's also far more complicated. So essentially, people started clearing forests on the island of Ireland from the beginnings of the Neolithic. So you're talking about 4000 BC, okay? Now that really kind of started to ramp up in the Bronze Age. That was the period where, that was when the biggest destruction of Ireland's forests happened. And I think, because we tend to think about people getting rid of trees by cutting them down. But I can tell you, like, if you went into my place with a stone or a bronze axe and started trying to clear the forest, you'd give up in kind of like a couple of hours and go off crying. Like, there's no way. I'm not saying that nobody cut down any trees, but I think that the way most of the forests were cleared in Ireland was in the exact same way as the forest was starting to die off in my place when I arrived, which is that if you have cows or any other kind of livestock and you put them into the forest, as you would, you're a farmer, you put the forest you put your animals in there, they go in and they eat, and you get meat and milk and hide and so on as a result. And Gaelic society was hugely based on cattle. Like the cattle were kind of everything, even in terms of social standing and everything. So if you were putting your cows into the forest and they were grazing off the seedlings, the forest would disappear, but it would happen over hundreds of years. So people wouldn't even realize it was happening at all, you know, because, you know, after 200 or 300 years, there'd be maybe only half the amount of forest that there was 200 or 300 years ago. But sure, I mean, a lifetime is what? Back then it would have been even shorter than now. I think that's the way that most of Ireland's forests disappeared. The truth in that saying about the English getting rid of Ireland's forests is that post-conquest, with the process of colonialisation, post kind of like 16th century and then ramping up, kind of accelerating into the 17th century, is that there was a much more aggressive approach taken to the forest because they were refuges for native resistance. They were, a lot of the colonialists were insecure because there were rebellions every so often, so they wanted to make quick cash out of the timber. And also they wanted to transform these places into agricultural land, which was worth more. And on top of all that, I think, you know, it's kind of interesting on all sorts of levels, because the colonists saw themselves as on this kind of divine civilizing mission, which applied to the unruly inhabitants, but also the ecosystems and in terms of bogs and forests, wild bogs and forests, and even the fauna, as in wolves. So you had kind of bounties placed on the heads of wolves and woodcairns, which were essentially kind of rebels, you know. And very interestingly, often and I'm talking about the 16th century now, the 17th century, so early 1600s, that kind of a period. Interestingly, the bounty on the head of a wolf was very often the same as on a woodcairn, you know. So it was, they were coming in and saying, and what they were seeking to do, and we have written reports from this time from the likes of Sir Richard Boyle, who was one of the main planters, was that they were seeking to turn wilderness into little pieces of Suffolk or Sussex, you know. But to go back to that point of how long has it been happening? It's been happening really since farming arrived, okay? So, you know, it's a complex thing. The other thing you're asking about is, how does what I'm doing, how can that be transferred to a more kind of an urban context like what you have here in Belfast? Well, I spent a fantastic part of the morning down in the Bog Meadows Nature Reserve earlier.
Class.
And that shows like what's possible. Like I was pretty blown away. I mean, just the context where you have the M1 running up the side of it and all these, you know, mega electricity pylons and the flat, these kind of tower blocks nearby, and yet this kind of really wild place right in the middle of all this. And when you're talking about, you know, where do you start? You start with where you have some nature left, you know, because if you try to do that on an area that's been a car park for the last 50 years, you're working from zero. Whereas if it's an area where you've got some wild nature, you've got all the seed sources, a lot of the fauna and the flora is already going to be there.
Yeah.
You create the conditions, and that stuff, like in my place, will all just start to kind of recompose, and you'll be building from a rich base. And it's the same, like, you know, in terms of expanding that 1% of forest that we have left. You know, it makes no sense to go, I mean, I'm not saying don't do it, but I mean, if you have a piece of existing forest that you can expand out, the results are going to be so much faster and better than if you go and try and create a wild natural ecosystem somewhere that's completely and utterly where there's nothing there. You know, I don't know. Does that kind of answer your question?
100%. Yeah. And my mind's already going. It feels like there's a job for everybody in this room to go and like map out these places that already exist, and then kind of go from there. But I'd like to just ask anybody if people have questions for Eoghan. Open it up to the floor, and we'll maybe take 2 or 3 at a time. Yes.
Well, thank you, first of all, just for raising awareness, showing people what's possible. I suppose from my point of view, I'm from here, grew up stone's throw away, and the mountain is very dear to me and holds a special place. But we see the same issues with cattle and sheep grazing on the mountain. Like you described it, you know, it's like somebody's up with strimmers, strimming the land, and nature hasn't a chance to do its thing. I just wondered about the conversations that you have had. Obviously, you've got a profile now. You know, the people that steward the land, the farmers. You know, we know that sheep farming, there's some money in it. It's propped up with subsidies. You know, how close are we to changing the conversation? Instead of subsidising people to graze their sheep, I mean, subsidise them to let nature revitalize itself, take back control.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, like, my sense is that on the one hand, so like I've been invited over to Scotland a couple of times in the last 2 years, and rewilding has just absolutely taken off there in the most incredible way. So you've got about 150 rewilding projects happening across Scotland, and some of these in one single project, quite a lot of them, are on a scale of kind of like 60, 70,000 acres. Now, unfortunately, a lot of that is based on a highly inequitable land ownership pattern where land ownership is hugely concentrated, but it does make amazing things possible ecologically, because one rich guy can come in, buy up a stalking estate of 60 or 70,000 acres, and the next day he's rewilding it, and you don't have to have kind of committee meetings to decide what to do. He's kind of like a dictator, and he just says, right, we're going to drop the deer population down from above 40 per square kilometre down to less than 1, and the result is a whole landscape comes to life with trees popping up everywhere, ospreys moving in to nest, golden eagles, ravens, pine martens, the whole lot. But anyway, compared to Scotland, we're absolutely in the halfpenny place. You know, things have yet to really kind of like to coalesce here and to be turned into concrete action. But my feeling is that there's a real change of mood among so many people across Ireland, and that will lead to results. On the other hand, there are massive vested interests opposed to any kind of a change. Now, I'm on better ground talking about the Republic in those regards than north of the border, but I would guess that it's pretty similar. Like, I'm aware of what's happening to Lough Neagh and stuff like that. And I think, you know, for some parts of farming, there's just massive money there. Like the dairy industry and all of that, they're making huge money, and they've also borrowed a lot. So, you know, it's all tied in with the banks and, you know, the industries that are producing all the chemicals and selling all the machinery, and it's not, and you know, and kind of like investment companies, and the whole financial system is invested in the status quo, and it's patently obvious that they perceive even the slightest little kind of chink of change as a threat. It's nearly like they're afraid that, like, you know, if they take their finger out of the kind of like the hole in the dike, that the whole dike will just give way. So they are fighting tooth and nail against any kind of change, you know. So it's kind of like, you know, it's nearly like two kind of implacable forces pushing in opposite directions. And I don't know how all this is going to play out, but I think the next 5 to 10 years will be really interesting. You know, I think there's a kind of an irresistible push for change. You know, just to come back to one thing you were talking about, the sheep and the cattle up on the mountain, it's important to understand that sheep are far more ecologically destructive than cattle. That's not to say cattle don't do damage to natural ecosystems, but sheep are far worse because they graze selectively, which means that if this room was outside and you had little native tree seedlings popping up here and there, and lots of other stuff, grass and other flora, and you put a sheep in here, the sheep would go straight for the tree seedlings because they're extra nutritious and therefore extra tasty. So they selectively graze out the tree seedlings. So they're a highly kind of like efficient method of repressing native natural forests. Cattle can do the same thing, but they're not as, you know, not quite so aggressively. Densities have to be higher. They have to be there more constantly. So it's just worth being aware of that. Yeah, I think, does that kind of answer, or is there more that have I not really answered your question at all?
No, it's a good insight there.
Okay.
It all comes from this kind of need, which you've satisfied, but which is in me, to go out into the forest, keep walking, change direction, and see something that catches your eye, and go that way, or stop for a moment, and take a few minutes here.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that needs fed within me.
Yeah.
But there's no avenues for it around you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I can only speak personally, but, you know, like, from the moment that I entered into this relationship with this wild place in Beara, my life has completely transformed. Like, and my you know, without wanting to sound corny, like, I honestly feel like my relationship with this planet has changed, it's like, you know, it's like an onion, and you peel back, suddenly a whole load of layers peeled back, and you entered into this much deeper understanding and relationship with our home planet, you know, and all of us should be able to. I mean, not everybody can go and kind of rewild their own rainforest in the Beara Peninsula, but we should all have access to places and involvement in places where we can, in various shapes or form, have that kind of a relationship. And what I'm seeing here in West Belfast is that people are really kind of like, you know, there's such an energy here, there's such a fantastic dynamic, and I can see that people here would be really kind of ready for these kind of explorations and to get really stuck in to stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, like, the way you talk about your land is how I feel about Godian and football.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but Pauline, did you have a question?
No, I'm just really kind of happy that I came. I was thinking I wouldn't come tonight. Now here I am, I'm so delighted because I used to live on the Beara Peninsula, and actually do think it's probably like I'm kind of emotional actually. I left there to come here. Yeah. And it's stunning. Like,
you're from here though, Pauline, are you? You're from Cork, okay.
City woman.
Yeah.
City, but I lived from there 4 years.
Yeah.
An offshore island there, and then coming here, and like the energy here for creating change, I don't think exists really in the same way in Cork. So like that magic is here, but there's another magic on the Beara Peninsula that isn't here. So I'm just
Yeah.
excited that the two things are meeting.
Great.
And
Yeah.
also, I was going to say something else, which is, really kind of what Leasha was saying, like how do we make this happen? Because Belfast has a lot of green space, in comparison to other cities, in comparison to Cork. Like we've one fucking park in Cork, Fitzgerald Park.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you have all the parks in this city, like saying about mapping all those green spaces out.
Yeah.
And even spaces that have been kind of left, are kind of neglected. I do think we should be mapping them out and bringing out some of that energy and some of those ideas.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's hard to, like, because we don't have, I guess we don't have that much time, but so it's hard to kind of synthesize what I'd say to you. But to do my best, what I would say is trust in nature, do you know? So, like, it's such a human thing to want to, and again, let me take planting trees as the example. So, like, I'm not saying, never plant trees. Sometimes you have to. But if you can, natural regeneration, not just of the trees, but all of the other wild flora that's in the area, just let that do its thing. So as much as you possibly can, try to stand back and let nature decide what it's going to do in a given area. And like, in a way, so a word that I've heard several times here since I arrived in West Belfast is decolonisation. And in a way, when you talk about rewilding, core to rewilding is decolonising your mind in another sense. So you're not talking about the kind of colonisation that's based on imperialist colonisation. It's another form. It's like, it's the human drive to control, to conquer land, to kind of like to dominate. And we nearly have to decolonize our own minds from that. So for example, yesterday I was in Dublin and I was walking past Trinity College there, right in the city centre. And Trinity has let the kind of like, they had these at the front, if you know Trinity on College Green, they've got two statues there on either side of the main entrance, and there's a kind of an open area around each one, and those used to be just little kind of like sterile lawns, and they've let those turn into wildflower gardens, and lots of people don't like it. They say, geez, that looks like a desperate mess, like, all this kind of like scraggly stuff growing in all directions. But it's fantastic in terms of what I'm talking about, because it's about that mind shift where you say, do you know what? It's not all about us and what we want. It's not about me deciding I'm going to put an oak there, a birch there, a holly here. It's about letting nature decide, do you know?
I'm dying to know what the fishermen and farmers on the Beara Peninsula think about why. I can just imagine them. Like, have you had much traction?
It's difficult for me to answer that question because they're not going to come to me and say, do you know what I think of you, But I think I could make a fairly educated guess, which is that, I think when I went from Dublin City to the Beara Peninsula, I had to learn a whole set of new rules, because things operate on all sorts of very different levels in the two places. And I think the most important thing that I learned, or that I kind of instinctively understood, was that if you go to a place like that and you're perceived as coming in from outside with an agenda that you're going to try and push on everyone else, it will really end badly for you. And so I actively did the opposite, that there is this kind of an unwritten rule that if you could do any kind of crazy crap in your place, so long as you're a good neighbour and you're not trying to push it on anybody else or having airs or graces that they're only these kind of uneducated peasants and you know better, you'll be grand. And so it has been grand, generally speaking. Because of the books being published and, you know, TV, I've been on the TV and radio and newspapers and all this kind of stuff. I think, you know, in a kind of a funny kind of a way, there's a little bit of a kind of a, you know, well, he might be a Dublin Jackie tree hugger blow-in, but he's our Dublin Jackie tree hugger blow-in, and kind of grudging respect. But, you know, to expect any of my neighbours to do what I'm doing would be completely unrealistic, because there's no money in it. And farmers' lands are their livelihoods. And if to do what I'm doing means essentially giving up your income from the land, and nobody's going to do that until society changes financial structures to make it a viable option for them. And that's one of the main things that I advocate for, is giving farmers the option of being paid to rewild their land. And I think that would be a real game changer. But again, you know, all of the vested interests, they don't want to hear, even though there are no downsides. I mean, nobody can come up with any kind of a good argument against that. You're not forcing anything on farmers. You're just giving them another option and letting them decide. But they won't do it because they're afraid of what might happen.
Thanks. Yeah, so maybe I'm conscious of the time, it's 10 to 9, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I'm happy to carry on. Maybe if we could take like a few questions at once, and then you can kind of rattle through the answers.
The only problem is I'll probably forget what the first one was.
All right, no worries. One at a time then. Who had a question? There was a few people at the back.
Mine's a quick one, because I don't know if there's anything you've researched. Do you know, is there anything in the Irish Rainforest, like medicinal, that you have in the Amazon, which is like so many magnesium, iodine, that the trees there all have different medicines? Is there any research on what medicines there might be in trees, or the?
I'm sure there is. Like one of the interesting things is that a lot of the flora has wort in the name, in the English name, and that's when that's part of the name, you know that it had a medicinal purpose in the past. So you've got tree lungwort and navelwort and a whole bunch of others that I probably can't think of now. So I'm sure it absolutely does. However, there is one thing which I'll add here, which Leasha probably won't like, but I have an attitude to my place of strict non-extractivism. So I don't go in and take anything out. So there's no I don't do any kind of foraging. I don't take out any kind of dead wood for firewood or anything like that. I leave it all for nature. Now, I know that's a whole kind of other argument, which we probably don't have time to get into. I'm aware of how foraging brings people to nature, but I think we also need to learn to be able to not see everything in terms of what we can use it for, and be able to leave some places just for nature. And a good example of the reason why is the thing of taking wood, trees that die or whatever, branches that break off in storms, not using them for firewood. You know, it's estimated that around 20% of the species that potentially can live in a native forest depend on dead wood for part of their life cycle, the saproxylic species. So, you might think that taking out a bit of dead wood, sure, all you're doing is, otherwise it's going to just rot away and be wasted. But actually, no, it's as important as the living trees are, if not more so. So that gives just some example of why I have that kind of philosophy.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else have a question there, Kieran?
Yeah, Kieran Waggett, Owen, thank you very much.
Falter
I was delighted to hear that your one word that you're going to take back away is Belfast, the colonies. We've firmly done our job in this part of the world.
Yeah.
You mentioned the energy in the place, and I think a lot of that is now, not solely, but a lot of that is down to the Northern San Francisco community around the revival of the Irish language. And with Belfast, I'm sure you had an indication from the time is
I
One
have.
of the most economically deprived areas, but certainly across the urban environment, it's one of the strongest areas in terms of language revitalisation.
Yeah.
And we had Michael Conan here last year. I'm sure you're aware of, and he gave a talk on ecology and also the links with the language and the importance of kind of to get a true grasp of our connection with the land is rooted in.
Yeah, I don't know who Michael Cronin is, I'm afraid.
He's
Kieran.
a professor in the University of
Trinity.
Trinity.
Okay.
Yeah. But he's done a lot of work on ecology and stuff.
Yeah.
But he talked about the importance of understanding language
Mm.
and our connection with the land is transferred through the Irish language, obviously.
Yeah.
And to try and reconnect all of that. And we're seeing we're seeing all these mini revivals happening. The work that you're doing in terms of many others are doing in terms of connection with nature.
Yeah.
We're seeing people like Mangan and the work that they're doing around Irish mythology and reconnecting.
Mm.
Irish traditional music is undergoing a massive revival, and obviously the language as well. And there's all these threads of their own kind of ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I just think in terms of making a bigger change that Robbie was talking about, and factoring into the political level.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on putting that all together as part of a grand narrative, around reconnecting all these disparate threads around language, land, nature, and culture in general, and trying to provide people, trying to join the dots between all those?
I think there's huge potential there, but I have to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit and say that, like, and this is me speaking personally now, by all means, because there are so many connections. Like one of the things that, as part of writing this book, that in researching the ecological history of the area where I live in Beara, it was, you can't understand the ecological history without understanding colonization and conquest and human history, if you like. It's all completely intertwined. But I think that you kind of need to go beyond that also and understand that on another level, it's kind of natural ecosystems and people impacting natural ecosystems for thousands of years. And it nearly doesn't matter, if you look at it from a certain perspective, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about, what people were doing here pre-conquest or what happened after. It's literally just human impacts on nature. So I'm probably going to regret everything I'm saying now, because it's not really making sense, or it's difficult to make sense of, but I'm trying to convey a concept here that, all of this stuff that you're talking about is absolutely valid and important, and there's huge potential for doing all this, but just be aware, I guess just be respectful of nature, and don't think that it's all about us, because that's the trap that we so easily as a species fall into, is thinking that it's all about us and how we feel about nature and how we're relating to it. And we kind of tend to place ourselves at the center of the scene, and nature just becomes this kind of backdrop for us to do what we're doing with all this stuff all around us. And I would urge caution around that, because I think the biggest lesson that we have to learn is to transcend that and let nature do its thing, rather than just some kind of an appendage of us. But that, none of that is in any way to kind of like diss what you're talking about. I think what you're talking about is really, there's huge potential, and I think it would be brilliant. So please don't misunderstand what I'm trying to say here. Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. Sean, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just, a wee bit of to the next time in a couple of weeks' time, kind of plug as well, but I think what Kieran's talking about there, for me, coming up in the Irish language education schooling system, for me what happened there on Bhaoi is what's happened with you in Beara.
Yeah.
Somebody went and had a go, and something happened, and that thing grew into something amazing.
Yeah.
So There's a couple of families in Bhaoi had a go.
Yeah.
They knew something was out of sync. They
Yeah.
knew something was wrong, and they had a go.
Yeah.
And what they did was planted seeds that grew in a defiant forest,
Mm.
shooting in a million directions.
Yeah.
And for me, the deeper meaning of decolonisation is getting a grasp of that, right down to the root of knowing how deep the colonizer is in yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Knowing that you are a big part of the problem, that the food that you eat and the clothes that you wear,
Yeah.
that you use, and the buttons that you press and the toys that you want,
Mm.
you are the colonizer.
Yeah.
And decolonisation is about deconstructing yourself too.
Yeah.
And that for me has been one of the most transformative experiences. My activism is blending those two realms,
Yeah.
blending those realms together in Guardian of Fubble and other places in the city,
Mm.
where you are doing at times targeted rewilding and planting, but you're doing it to awaken the consciousness of five groups of school kids
Yeah.
as to what is a tree, and where it come from, how it grew, and
Yeah.
who minded it, and P5 planted it, and P7 grew it up, and somebody else spread water on it, and then next thing it was a forest.
Yeah.
800 years from now, who knows? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
For
I mean,
me, I think
yeah.
it's illusion around all that. This
No, fair play, Sean. I mean, like what I'd say. Sorry.
On
The
the
9th of November, we'll
Yeah.
be heading up the mountain with some P5.
Right.
For a bit of decolonisation.
Okay.
Everybody wants to go with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think like it'd be fair to say like in the Republic, I would be considered by other people, a lot of other people who are kind of like interested in similar stuff. I'd be probably seen as something of a purist, you know, because I'm always talking about, for example, natural regeneration as opposed to planting. But I don't care if I'm seen as a purist. I'm speaking truth as I see it. And it's based on the fact that this forest that I have, or it's not mine, like I shouldn't even speak like that. This forest that exists, it came into being because people literally left it alone, do you know? Because we have this idea, oh, let's make a forest, do you know? But actually the best forest you can make is by standing back and getting rid of the invasives or whatever, but otherwise just letting it do its thing, do you know?
class. Did anybody else have a question? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have so much of a question. Yes, well, thanks for coming up, Mheán.
Yeah.
I've just followed you for about 4 or 5 years on Twitter, and you've
Right.
actually taught me a lot. Yeah, more so sort of probably local interest for people here and sort of relevant to that. I'm very lucky. I live up on a cottage up on the mountain, that's what's in its shadow. So,
Wow.
you know, when you talk about like, the urban environment in rewilding, we're very lucky here. We live in an urban-rural interface really as opposed to that.
Yeah.
You know, even on, I saw a photo of people maybe remembered even here, the Mheán Fómhair hotel, almost a photo from where we stand less than 100 years ago, this was countryside. You know,
Wow.
these estates didn't exist.
Yeah.
And the farming practices back then were much more intense. You know, I have a different view of actually what's happened up on Black Mountain. You know, living up there, certainly not a farming background, I have 2 donkeys.
Yeah.
They're farmers, but are, you know, from being full-time farmers to part-timers, and that practice is sort of intensified across the whole of the mountain. So you've actually saw a massive change and a massive increase in potential woodland and that. You know, I would argue
Yeah.
KFL, Buck Reynolds, we've one of the richest ecosystems just up there, and we have areas of temperate rainforest. We've, if anyone knows the gully,
Yeah.
you couldn't beat that in spring for bluebells, wood and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
You know, we had a bat survey done recently. 8 out of the 9 species of bats were always out there.
Oh wow.
A very healthy population.
Fantastic.
A few weeks ago,
Yeah.
within 3 days, peregrines, kestrels, buzzards. Yeah, you know, it's incredible, and it's what we
Yeah.
live here.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, certainly different challenges as opposed to out on the Beara Peninsula.
Yeah.
So, you know, we have, must be relevant to, you know, the housing crisis here is one of the most intense in the whole of the province. And we've
Really?
almost exhausted our boundary lines, so we have 3
Okay.
new housing estates approaching the mountain. We're losing our buffer zones.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's concern about those lines being redrawn and how, you
Yeah.
know, how we do balance that massive need for housing
Yeah.
with, you know, trying to preserve our local area. Black Mountain's
Yeah.
different, it's not like KFL, it's not owned by the council, it's all privately owned.
Right.
I would argue that's actually been at strike because it's been left alone.
Yeah.
And that's why it has flourished.
Yeah.
But then that also just comes with challenges, and we do need changes with you know, you talk about funding and things like that, so that big hill you'll see up there, my neighbours were funded for a long time by the EU grants for keeping that as farmland. They actually
Right.
lost that because it has rewilded.
Yeah.
So the incentive is almost the opposite.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Trying to achieve.
Yeah, it's the same in the Republic. Like, yeah, you're financially penalised if you're a farmer and you let areas go wild. Like, you know.
As I suppose even recently, you know, I think there's a balance and interests as well, but we talk about access, and you know, I know a lot of people maybe don't access the mountain as much as they should. You know, I'm very lucky that I know every corner of it, but some people just don't know that and just wouldn't go adventuring really because there isn't formal paths.
Yeah.
So there's also that sort of motivation from council. They have a programme to increase access to the mountain and this type of thing, and how that can threaten our local nature and attitude around it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Myself and Sean were just talking about that briefly before we came in. Like, you know, I mean, it's a tricky one because on the one hand, if people don't have access to nature, it doesn't mean anything to them, and they're not prepared to kind of like fight for it, or you know. But on the other hand, yeah, I mean, if a piece of wild ground is completely kind of like has people tramping through it the whole time, it's going to be ecologically downgraded very fast. So you have to try and find a balance between these two things. You know, it's a tricky one.
Yes.
Hi, Eoghan. Thanks very much for coming on to Belfast. I'm going to blow into West Belfast, being from North Belfast.
Would that be the Ardine or somewhere like that?
No, slightly not here. I was down in the Beara Peninsula this summer
Right.
in Irish.
Oh, great.
For the festival week.
Yeah.
I came to your land. And
Oh, did you? You were part of that group, were you?
the day before, I'd been to Derrin in Laura, which is the garden of
Yeah.
the kind of ancestral home of William Carey.
That's right. Yeah.
People don't remember who William Carey is, but he was Oliver Cromwell's right-hand man, and
Yeah.
he was kind of the architect of much of the philosophy behind the colonial project. So Beara Peninsula is in many ways kind of ground zero of the British Empire. Like, it's a super interesting thing.
It is, yeah.
I was very much playing back and forth, kind of like I was at a tennis match, watching everybody in my audience's response to your talk. So there was a couple of the gardeners and one of the chaps from Laura there asking questions.
Oh, really? I didn't realise that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you knew who they were that was there asking questions. But yeah.
No, I didn't. I mean, I've done so many talks that I've only vague memories of that one. I remember one woman started having a go at me because I was talking about native species. She didn't like that. And she was saying, you know, what's the difference between Sika deer and native red deer, and who am I to decide one is okay and the other isn't? All this kind of stuff,
I
yeah.
know you've spoken a lot about that idea about there being a kind of drive towards this, you know, ecological diversification within the island of Ireland. I guess what I took away from that was even in a group of people who are interested in this,
Yeah.
there are some really like deeply held, like emotional reactions to kind of
Yeah.
changing the way in which we connect with the land. And I guess I'm kind of curious what this guys kind of,
Yeah.
I know you're coming from that position of this is a decolonial project, but I guess to my mind, in the broader sense, like here we all are living in Ireland, and I guess down south you have that sense of we're all Irish now, do you know that
Yeah.
kind of way, even when kind of people descended from William Carey, you know?
Yeah.
And there's a curiosity there about a kind of growing ecological project, and I do think that that's an innate human desire, like as much as it probably is a human desire to like conquer the land and to farm it, to get productivity from it. We do all have that desire to kind of connect with nature.
Yeah.
I guess I just don't think that you need to necessarily be speaking Irish or to connect with the land that's there. I just think that that's a shared human characteristic there, the kind of
Yeah,
like,
I
do
mean,
you have that kind of thought and devil's advocate kind of position to take with that kind of the colonial stuff that
yeah.
is probably in the zeitgeist at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult thing for people, you know. I mean, like, if you objectively look at the trajectory of human existence, it's all been in one direction, you know. So, I mean, like, if you go back in time, you know, back to, so farming is about 10, 12,000 years old. Before that, everybody were hunter-gatherers, everybody on the planet. And farming was such a massive revolution. It was like, okay, so we're, instead of kind of moving through a landscape, you know, hunting this or picking berries or nuts or whatever, we're going to take these pieces of land and we're going to transform, we're going to get rid of all of that wild ecosystem and turn it into something, whether it's grass or whatever other type of crop, bit of grass for livestock or whatever it is, we're going to devote that land entirely to producing food for us, do you know? And that is the direction we've been going in for so long now. And what rewilding is suggesting is going in the opposite direction. And that is a really difficult one for people, but it's also one that brings up so much stuff. So like even amongst I'd be fairly clued into all the major advocates of rewilding, both in the UK and in Ireland. And I wouldn't say, I'd say you'd struggle to find two of them who agree on absolutely everything, because we all have kind of slightly different takes on things, you know. And it is a really difficult one. I was going to say something else there about something that you raised, but it's gone. Sorry.
Thanks so much for your question. And Kieran, I don't know if you want to respond to that in any way, because it was also a kind of a question put to you. No pressure. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
No, I mean, definitely wasn't planned. It was exclusive or that anyone had to recognize. I just think it's one of the things that are probably making a large part of our population in areas like this engage and reimagine the type of world that they live in, which is an avenue to get them interested in things like nature, because as Eoghan was saying, if we live in a very urban environment, you have no contact with nature, then barefoot, where you start to learn about place names, you start to learn about the place where we're from, which informs all that, then there's a likelihood you will have more interest in it. And that's certainly what we've found anecdotally speaking in these areas. So it isn't just the preserve of Irish spirit, but certainly there are things like the Irish language in my view will certainly help the cause of nature around.
Yeah. And I honestly hope I didn't come across as if I was kind of like, you know, in any way disagreeing with you. I think everything you said is bang on. I was just trying to introduce into our conversation something that for me goes beyond all that, which is just trying to move away from this human thing of what's called anthropocentrism. It's all about, you know, we tend to always place ourselves at the centre, and, you know, the ultimate decolonisation, I guess, is to be able to move away from that. And instead of seeing ourselves in the centre, seeing ourselves as a part of the whole thing rather than the ultimate controller of it all, you know. But just to come back on what the woman from a posher part of North Belfast, that's not the Ardine, was saying, I had a fantastic talk earlier. I spent about an hour and a half with this guy called Limbo, who runs the community St. James's, I think, yeah, community farm. And one of the interesting things he told me is, because his little farm thing is down, I mean, my geography of West Belfast wouldn't be great, but I think he's kind of between Sandy Row and the Falls Road, more or less. And he was telling me that he has various people who come along to do all sorts of different activities, including volunteering on all sorts of different ways, and that there's a really good mixture from both sides. And it's nearly like that stuff, that divide doesn't matter when they're doing things in his place. So, you know, just to just to go back to that comment earlier. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, at the end of the day, we are just all people, you know, and nature. Again, this is a kind of a personal thing, but I don't think nature cares in some sort of sense. You know, it just sees us all as we are all just one species, whether we're Irish, British, Italian, French, Syrian, Portuguese, Japanese. We are the same species, you know, and it's good not to forget that, I think.
Thank you. There was a couple of hands that went up. I don't know if people had any further questions or comments. Yes.
There's a lady here who's been trying to.
One wee question on. Thanks very
Yeah.
much for coming. I just found this really interesting. I work in community garden spaces in another part of the city.
Yeah.
My English is posh is not it's just what I'm picking up here and what you can see here and what I'm sort of thanking you for is having this recorded and having the conversation about the fact we even have the term Irish Rainforest and understanding what that is in this context. But I think ultimately, and we're all here on the same boat, whether it's language, whether it's nature, it's about education and the shared space and moving that forward.
Yeah.
And lots of ways you do it because I work in community horticulture. It's just that the benefits of nature and about not being egocentric in that. I just think that idea that we're not in the middle of it and we need to appreciate it, and we've seen it through COVID where nature was on that spring whether we were out in it or not, and that was happening. But I think education and just keeping this conversation going about our need to be more aware and just for our well-being, because we are too disconnected from nature and purpose and things.
Yeah.
But also in terms of mention about agriculture and the changes in that. I know down south there would be lots of big farms, especially down the country, from a small farm up in the northwest. And there's an idea that those land uses could be changed if we can get in touch with departments and government.
Yeah.
As small as farms break up or get smaller, we can set aside. We might have the luxury if the farm isn't being intensively farmed, it's having those opportunities. So I suppose it's just outside of an urban environment, continuing that conversation with the agriculture sector and changing, because it is a tough industry to be in, small farms.
It is.
So to set aside, but they all do come, most farmers will come with the love of the land and if it's been in the family. Therefore, to understand this is a positive and it's something that they can take on board now.
I think it's a tricky one, because I think, you know, I mean, like where I am, it's small farms of rough land as well. And there's a love of the land, but it's you know, it's also always been about struggling to survive from the land. So it's like, it's about turning wild rough land into kind of productive good land, which essentially means getting rid of nature. And we need to be under no illusions about that. And that doesn't mean we blame people for doing that. I mean, people are just trying to survive, but we have to be honest and realistic about what's been going on here if we're to turn it around, you know? So
if we stop that, if you turn like quality land into productive land, if you leave it a year or two, it will just revert.
yeah, it might do, not always. I mean, like if people are spreading large amounts of fertilizer on land for extended periods, a lot of the wild native flora won't be able to come back because the fertility levels will be kind of artificially elevated and stuff like that. And if you're kind of clearing away the wild natural flora for so long that the seed sources are lost, then again it can't come back. Or even extinct species, like, you know, Ireland has lost a huge amount of species that are key to ecosystem function. So, you know, you can't just stand back. They're not going to come back without us reintroducing them. So, you know, and I think, you know, just to say one thing that I think is important. If we're going to use the word rewilding, I mean, the word is quite debated in terms of its meanings and so on, but I think like it's really important to be clear on the fact that it does not mean agriculture. Like agriculture, it kind of means not farming. You know, now you got all these various different types of rewilding, like Knepp Estate in the south of England, where what they're doing is kind of like something in between the two. But really, rewilding should mean just letting land go back to wild nature, and the key thing is to be dominated by natural processes. So farming is an extractive activity, and it's an artificial extractive activity that inevitably compromises natural processes, and we need to be aware of that, you know, and not to kind of blur those margins between the two, you know.
Brilliant. Well, unless anybody has any further questions, maybe we'll leave it there. Do you have any final words for us?
I'll just say, like, because one thing I didn't really get a chance to say while I was talking is, like, if you're saying, okay, so this guy is after coming up from Beara and telling us there's all these Irish rainforests, how do you know if you're in an Irish rainforest? And I'll just tell you how you know. It's an abundance of what are called epiphytes. So epiphytes are plants that grow on trees without being rooted in the ground. So it doesn't include the likes of ivy or honeysuckle, which are climbers that are rooted in the ground and grow up the trees. Epiphytes. So if you go into the forest in my place, or the same up in Breen in Antrim, or other patches of temperate rainforest around Ireland, and you look up into the trees, and I saw this on Cave Hill actually, in some of the trees, you'll see a lot of mosses on the branches for a start there, epiphytic mosses, but you'll also see stuff like ferns, polypody fern, and even flowering plants and other types of ferns growing on the branches and the trunks of the trees. That's how you know you're in rainforest. And if you go to any rainforest on the planet, tropical, subtropical, cloud forest, whatever, they all have loads and loads of epiphytes. So that's how we know. I'm not just making stuff up about these being rainforests. They're definitely rainforests. And that's how you know if you're in one or not, is by the presence. It doesn't mean that if you see, you know, one little patch of moss on a tree, you're in a rainforest. There has to be a lot of this stuff, you know.
Thank you so much. Big hand for Eoghan.
Thank you.